I'm Frances Blumkin Batt, and I was born in Fort Dodge, Iowa, February 1, 1918. And when we were in Fort Dodge, actually, uh, my mother hadn't arrived. My father had preceded her in about 1914, and she came via Seattle because at that time it was World War I. She didn't have a passport, but she arrived in Fort Dodge, Iowa, where not only did my father greet her, but her two brothers that she hadn't seen since about 1913. And her brothers' names were Sam Gorelick and Mayor Gorelick. And of course, my mother's maiden name was Rose Gorelick. So we lived it was old, my mother tells me, when we lived in Fort Dodge, Iowa. And we had the most delightful time about 20 years ago. Norman and I returned to my hometown because I always said I wanted to see where I was born. Lo and behold, with my mother's instructions and what was on my birth certificate, we found the house. Believe it or not, that time probably it was over 100 years old, and the the woman who owned it was very reluctant to let us in, and I finally said, I was born in an upstairs bedroom, and I'd be so appreciative if you would let us in, which she finally did. So that was just a thrilling, I can't tell you. It was just one, first of all, the house was still standing. That was the miracle. And my mother loved the people in Fort Dodge. There was a very tiny Jewish community, but she was surrounded with only people who could only speak English, and she was desperate. She could not, um, she could not communicate, and it became a desperate situation. She says to my father, I don't know what I'm going to do. I have to get to a bigger town. I want to go to Omaha. And she had Light here, and I'm sure my father knew people too, and that's where I want to go. Well, actually, we got to Omaha, Nebraska in January 1919, when I was very naturally not almost a year old, but when I was 6 months old and still in Fort Dodge, Iowa. I was one of those, plus my mother, who caught the dreadful flu that killed so many thousands of people. So I was in the hospital, my mother was in the hospital, and my father would come. He didn't get it, and he would come to visit it, and finally they dismissed my mother, but I was left behind. And my mother says to my father, if I don't get that baby home, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. My father could not pay the hospital bill, which was $25. So he goes in one day, has a blanket, and kidnaps me from the hospital. And incidentally, my father has good credit. Much later, he paid the hospital bill. But anyway, fortunately, she recovered, I recovered, and we arrived in Omaha in January 1919. And the most wonderful part was, at that time, World War I had ceased. In November of 11 was Armistice Day, and World War I was over. And actually, my two uncles, I know my Uncle Sam, believe it or not, he was studying engineering at the University of Iowa, and then they drafted him, and he never did finish. And my uncle, both of them, served, but not overseas. They were inducted here and never did go overseas. So, at any rate, so I start out my new life not knowing much. I'm not a year old yet. And where my mother moved was Caldwell Street, about 25th and Caldwell. And her recollection was, when I was a tiny little infant, that the Noggs, that would be uh, Ralph Nogg's mother, Ernie, um, and Charlotte Slusky Coombe, they lived up the street. And one day I was playing in the gutter, and a horse came by, and Mrs. Nog rescued me. So my mother always loved her because she was a lovely person anyway. The neighborhood was something that I certainly grew up in, even through my first year of college. We always had mixed neighborhoods, so that whatever creed you had, whatever color we all, that's how we grew up. And it was the kind of experience I feel for myself, that I was a very, very lucky person to know about other people in the world, to get along with other people in the world. Of course, my mother always, she got along uh, just great. Once she found people who could speak her language, she was fine. And the truth is, it was my great delight. I didn't care for it at first. I never spoke a word of English because all I ever heard was Yiddish. So now I realize, I wasn't too old before I realized how lucky I was. And I only regretted when my mother and father didn't want us to know they spoke in Russian. I could have learned Russian too, but I didn't. So um, my brother Louis, well, he was born in Omaha, and he was just a year and a half older than I, so he was born in June of 1919. And uh, by that time, my mother had found her Landslight, some of her relatives, and she knew everybody in town. And the great joy that the immigrants had was going to Elmwood Park. And now here I sit in a house. It's so funny how Elmwood Park has played such a large part in my whole life. And so, at any rate, uh, my parents came on the streetcar, and it was my brother and me, and my mother puts me under a tree, not me, Louis, puts him under a tree so he would be out of the sun and he could sleep. We all return home, and my mother, when we get home, says to my father, "Where's the baby? Where's the baby?" My father says, "Oh, I don't know." She says, "Oh, he was so little I forgot him. He was too new." So back my father got on the streetcar, and of course all these people, they were watching the baby. They surely would have returned him, I know. And at any rate, we lived on Caldwell Street, for not too long. And at that time, in Fort Dodge, Iowa, my father was a peddler. And he peddled anything and everything, as did my two uncles. They all worked as a team. And uh, when he got to Omaha, the thing that he did in order to earn a living was, first he had a little shoe repair shop. And believe it or not, it was in the Millard Hotel building, which was grand and glorious, but just starting to fade from its glory. At that time, it still was magnificent. And that's where he began to earn a living. And my mother, even with two little tykes, she would put us in a buggy and go help him whenever she could. And so times were hard, but My mother's goal in life at that time was if there was any way in the world that she could bring her family, which was large, I believe by the time one group came, there were 7 or 8 that actually came on the boat together. And we're very fortunate. I have a passport picture of the group. And she saved every penny, and she knew how to save pennies. Because one day in the store, my father says, I'm going to go out and get a bottle of pop, which cost a nickel. And my mother says to him, please don't spend the nickel. We can take that nickel and we can put it in the money that we're saving for the tickets for the ship for my family. And believe it or not, it was maybe through nickels dime. It wasn't big money, and it took a couple of years. Her 2 brothers contributed too, and I think she told me that approximately $2,000 was the cost of the ship's tickets. And then that eventually was accomplished in 1922. And it was a hazardous trip because when my grandfather when they got to Riga, Latvia, I believe it was, and that was one of the departure points, or maybe they went there to wherever the ship left, they put my grandfather in jail. But they treated him so good. They brought him kosher food. The reason for putting him in jail, in my own mind, was if somebody could get a payoff. I mean, what could he have done wrong? He was the kind of man, he never earned much. And when he earned it, he was a rabbi. Whatever he ever earned, he gave away. So in truth, the family had a very difficult time because they really had to find food. They had a little garden in back, and that's where my mother incidentally showed some of her abilities and prowess, because my grandmother, in order to survive, she started a little grocery store. And the way she did it was they lived in a one-room house. Of course, it was earth, an oven, no heat inside, no indoor plumbing, practically no beds. My grandfather and grandmother had a bed. The rest of them slept on the floor, and then they sometimes slept on the stove. And so my grandmother would have my mother go to whatever little store there was in the little town, which was Shadrin in Russia. And she would buy flour and sugar. And then my grandmother would, like the middleman, she would sell to the neighbors and make somewhat of a living. It wasn't much, I'll tell you what, because sometimes they actually had no food. So when my mother was 5 years old, she went to Mr., oh, maybe I'll think of his name, the grocer. And she had the order that Batt gave her. And she ordered all the groceries, and the way that the grocer added the figures, he had an abacus. This is one of those, I think it's a Chinese invention, but it's like a little bar and it has beads. And you take the beads and you count the beads, and that's how you figure. And when he told her how much she owed, the grocer, my mother says to the grocer, Mr. whoever, Droshka or something like that, you've made a mistake. You overcharged me 2 kopkas. And he says, okay, I'll refigure. And he says, you know something? You're right. He says, ooh, you are so smart. And that was, one of the glimmerings of what was yet to be with her. And the thing about it is that my mother was the oldest girl of the 7 children. There were actually 9 children. The firstborn were twin girls. Unfortunately, one lived only a few weeks, and the second girl died about a year and a half old. So uh, my mother was the oldest girl and always with my mother because the uh, the boys had to go to cheder, you know, they had to have that kind of an education, and my grandfather was adamant about that. And uh, so, at any rate, um, she always said to my Bobby, from the time she was very tiny, and of course this is my mother's story to me, and that's where I got the information. She says, when I grow up, I am going to go to America, and I'm going to make money there, and I'm going to send for all of you, and I'm going to bring you all to America, which she did. She was 13 years old and decided to leave home to find her uh, way in the world. And my grandmother had a special new pair of leather. She never had any shoes. So she gets the cobbler to make her a pair of shoes to go to Gommel, the big town, which she called, in Yiddish, she called it Homle, but I believe on the map it's Gommel. At any rate, she's 13 years old, and she wanted to save the new shoes, slings the shoes over her back, and walks barefooted about, I think she told me it was 13 miles. It was a terrible distance till there was a place where she could take a train, and she got to the big city. And of course, my mother always was a very small person. So when she gets to the big city, she's looking for a job. And she goes from place to place, and she has no luck till she finally hits a general store where there's a Jewish man who runs the general store. And he looks at her and he says, well, I don't know if you'll be able to do the job to be a sales lady. My mother says, try me. She says, give me a chance. If you give me a chance, if you like me, you'll keep me. If you don't like me, you won't keep me. But she said he was so good to her, they lived like everywhere else when you're trying to earn a buck, they lived in the back of the store. So it was this Jewish man and his wife, and maybe they had other children. They took care of my mother. In other words, she got her meals, she got her room, and what happened was that she had this instinct and this genius for retail. But it wasn't just retail. She knew how to talk to the customer. She knew how to display goods. And finally it got where the owner said, uh, you go ahead and order the goods. And you go ahead and you manage this. So she worked there from 13 till 19, where by that time she'd met my father, and they were married before he went to America. So this town was a railroad town. So my mother, I'm sure at that time she could speak German too, because there were many German. It was really a confluence of people from, and you know, after Europe and Russia, I mean, everything is compact. Not Russia, but all those other countries. And this was a railroad junction. So she would meet people from many other parts of that country and countries. And as I say, I'm almost sure that at that time she could she could speak German. I don't know. I mean, no, there were Polish, there were Lithuanian. We really never spoke much about whether she knew the language, but at the same time, uh, she had a good time too. She would go. She would be asked, but she wouldn't go with anyone who wasn't Jewish. But she would be asked to different balls. She called them balls, and they were masked balls. And she liked dancing, and she would uh, she would go by herself. So she had fun, and eventually she meets my father, who was working in a shoe store, I believe, there. They were married in 1914. And uh, before the war began, my father, at any rate, when they were married, they went and told her parents and stuff, and her mother says to her, I want to give you a big wedding, my daughter, but I don't have much, but I'm going to do it anyway. And my mother says, nothing doing. We're not borrowing any money. I don't need a big wedding. So my mother told me they had a pound of rice, and I can't remember what else for the food, but they were married. But then my father took off because I'm sure that her two brothers had already gone in about 1913, but he probably went, and I know he did, to escape the Russian army. And here's an interesting nugget. Our name really isn't Blumkin at all. It was Rozovich. That was my father's name. And what he did was he wanted to get away from the Russian army, so he stole somebody's papers and went by the name of Blumkin. His first name, Isidore Yitzchak, was his name, but not Blumkin. And the way we found it out, in America, when we were all here in Omaha, my father says, you know what? Of course, we knew he had a brother in Russia and some other relatives. His relatives, actually his mother was alive because my mother met his mother and just loved her. She was just a lovely person. My father says to us one day, I have an uncle in New York City, and his name is Dr. Daniel Ross. They shortened it from Rozovich, and he's a dentist on Fifth Avenue, believe it or not. That's how we found out about the name Rozovich. We never knew about it. And I will tell you, I'm going to skip to 1939, because in 1938, I went to Washington, D.C. to work for AZA for B'nai B'rith. And I went up with a friend of mine, Adeline Spector. She was a childhood friend of mine. And we go to visit Dr. Ross, Dr. Daniel Ross. I meet his wife, and they have a lovely apartment. And he says, my daughter's name is Florence. I thought that was interesting because my name was Frances. That was kind of close. And she looked something like me, too. I met her. She was married, had one child, but I remember that in the apartment, of course, at 1939, believe me, I thought it was some kind of a palace. It was absolutely gorgeous. They had a second child, but their youngest child, Bernard, was in the apartment when we met them, and we were having a big discussion, and they said to Adeline and me, we're communists. And we didn't say anything. And pretty soon, my aunt, Dr. Ross's wife, and Dr. Ross say to us, how would you like to become a communist? And I always was awfully proud of myself that I had the guts, because at that time I was very shy, and I never said no to anybody. My mother said to do something, I did it. My dad did something. I never said no to anybody, and I said, no, I don't think so. And then we lost contact with them. First of all, we'd had World War II. And by that time, there were already the rumblings in Europe, and we had Hitler and all that stuff. So I never made contact. Another time, when I returned to New York, I tried to find them, but they were nowhere. So to go back to Omaha, Nebraska, and where I found out where my real name was, at any rate, I think it's fascinating that when my mother, she didn't go to America till 1917, but actually what happened was she actually had a baby boy after my father left, and unfortunately, he was born dead. He had the umbilical cord wrapped around him, um, and his name was David. Isn't that funny that I remember? And so from 1914 or 50, whatever year it was then by the time she had the baby, she could not get out of Russia till finally uh, she decides that she's going to go. And it was a marvelous thing in reconstructing my mother's timeline. And for her 100th birthday, I had a map made of all the places that she went to in Russia. I have a wonderful map. And as a matter of fact, Carolyn Magid drew the map for me and listed all the names that my mother could remember, all the places in Europe, Russia, and here in America. So we got some wonderful dates because of worldwide shattering events. The day my mother leaves for America, Rasputin is killed. So I went to the history books and I got that date, so I knew that's when she started off on her trip for America. Now, she was always gutsy, and she's going to America. Does she have much money? No. She's got a wedding band, she's got some stuff in a little, probably a knapsack. She didn't have very much. But I remember about the ring, and she didn't have much money, and they were stolen. So she had not a cent, and she got on the Trans-Siberian Railroad without a ticket. And then what she did, if she saw the conductor coming, being as small as she would hide under a bench. I mean, I guarantee you that the train was very crude. It was probably hard wooden benches, packed. You wouldn't know who was on the train or not on the train. And she is off to America. No passport. Whether she had identification on her even, I have no idea. That part I don't think I really know. And she starts out on the trek in January of 1917 via Seattle, New York, and the eastern part of the country, because of the war, was non-accessible. And there was only one way to come, and it was via Japan. And so the way she went through Manchuria, through Harbin. She got to Chin, China. Now, when she got to the border crossing, there were Russians there, and they said, "Where's your passport?" She says, "Well, I lost it, or I don't have it with me, but I'll tell you what. I'm going to cross the border, but when I come back, I'm going to bring you a bottle of vodka if you let me through." The guy lets her through. So she got through that border. She departs by ship from Chin. It's like T-S-I-N, China. She goes via Japan, and she has to wait for a ship that will go to America. So she goes she told me a lot of other Jewish people were in this, probably I'd call it a hotel. I don't know what else to call it. And she spent some days in Yokohama waiting for this ship, and she just had the most delightful time because she learned of some of the customs of the Japanese people. And the one that she said, a man went to the public baths, a Jewish man, and he comes back and he tells the assemblage, who knows how many people there were, she says, he saw something that he thought he'd never seen in his life. The man and the woman and all the children and other families, they're stark raving naked, and they're all in the public bath. And my mother says, they laughed and they laughed and they laughed. It was wonderful. And then she went to some place where Japanese ladies hand-painted china. She said what they did was they strapped their babies to the back, to their backs, and thus they could work. And so she really had a wonderful time. Well, she got on the ship. The ship's name was Ava Maru. And when she got on the ship, she couldn't eat. She was sick the whole trip, desperately ill. Okay, but she has to get into Seattle and she has no passport. And at that time, naturally, it had to be something with the war. The, the borders were lax, whatever. They allow her to come in with, I think, no identification, no passport, no money, because afterwards, like at Ellis Island, always, you have any money, are you sick, etc. At any rate, when she got there, it was one of the most wonderful surprises of her whole life. First of all, when she set her foot on land, she stopped being so ill. And she has always loved HIAS. HIAS is Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And they put up all the Jewish people who were on the ship in this hotel, and it was Purim. See, so that's where I got another one of my dates. And she gave me the whole menu. Roast meat, roast potatoes. She said she never tasted, of course she probably hadn't eaten who knows how long. And with a tag, they tag her for, at that time my mother didn't go directly into Fort Dodge, Iowa. They put her on a train for Duncombe, Iowa, which was close to Fort Dodge. And that's where she had the happy reunion with my father and her brothers. And she and her brothers had, I'd call it an unholy alliance. They all depended on one another. They always helped one another. As a matter of fact, when my mother knew I was about to be born, my father was out peddling, but Uncle Sam was there. And my mother says, I think I'm going to have the baby. She says, Uncle Sam says, Chabza Harain in bed. Get yourself in bed. And she got in, poor thing, the first labor that she had was awful, awful. Bingo, I arrived, just like that. So, at any rate, as I say, they were always very close. She was always that close with her brothers, and she learned a lot from them too. They were, well, I'm proud of all of them. Each one had his own wonderful abilities, and some, well, my mother was in the genius class for sure, but she wasn't the only one. She had some pretty darn sharp siblings. So here she is with the tag, and she arrives in Duncombe, Iowa, and then when I'm born, well, I was Queen of the Nile, and so I had not only my father, and I remember them so well because my uncles took care of me too. And of course, I was the only baby around for a while till Louis arrived when, in 1919. But we always had a wonderful relationship. So at any rate, I want to tell you one of the reasons my mother said I must find Jewish people so I know how to talk. She says there were two maiden ladies next door to her in Fort Dodge in this old, old house. She says, oh, they had mice. It was awful. At any rate, one day these two ladies say in English, and my mother is oblivious to what they are telling her. They are saying to her, my father died this morning. And my mother said two words that she knew, that's nice. That's nice. Then she goes home and she tells one of her brothers, actually, she says, they said something to me. And I said to them, that's nice. And of course they knew how to talk English and they got to the bottom of it. She said she was going to die with shame for what she said. And that was one of the precipitating factors that without the communication, um, that she said she had to get to the bigger town. So, at any rate, when in the early days of Omaha, Nebraska, I told you I could not speak English. So, and I was the oldest of the four of us children, because there is Louie, and then there is my sister Cynthia, and my sister Baby, as I call her, but her name is Sylvia. And um, they learned English. They were way ahead of me. By the time they went to school, they knew how to talk English. I go to my first day of school and I come back home. I say to my mother in Yiddish, I said, I found some of the stupidest teachers that I ever met in my life. I said to my mother, they don't speak one word of Yiddish. I said, they're talking, but I don't know what they're saying. My mother says, honey, they are talking English, and I want you to learn English. And then she says, you know what? When you learn a word, will you teach me a word? I said, sure. She says, when you say a table, you know, and if you say it in Yiddish, um, I want you tell me the Yiddish, tell me the English. Yeah, a chair, a bunk, and so forth. So every time I would learn a word, and language was not one of her great one of her great assets. She had terrible time with linguistics, and she never changed, but she got along just fine. And so, at any rate, um, when I started school, I went to Kellum School, which was on about 24th and Charles at the time. And now, happily, that area, which is from Cumming to Lake and thereabouts on 24th Street, that was my world. Um, in about 1920, 1921, yeah, it was 1920 or 21, my father bought this house, 2110 Gray Street, which is always a part of my heart because it was wonderful. Again, a mixed neighborhood. And I forgot to mention on my mother's living, her living quarters when they arrived here. The first house she actually went to was out north of Omaha, and we went there. I took my mother there, near Hamilton Street, off, maybe 24th, between 24th and 30th. And that house, no indoor, that was her first house. No plumbing, no indoor plumbing, no heat, etc. And then she got this house on Caldwell, which was up a notch. But the happy time came like 1921. My father buys this house on Gray Street. So by that time, they have two children. And it's 1921. But one of the happiest days, of course, of my mother's life was 1922, when they had raised enough money to bring the whole mishpacha. They came, they had everybody. They not only had brothers and sisters in this group, and my grandfather, and my Bubba and Zeta, but they even had a cousin, and he was handicapped. But my mother, it was her sister's child. She promised to take care of that boy. She took care of him his whole life. And so my mother was always trying to raise a buck. So she would, believe it or not, even with two little babies, she rents out the house on Gray Street, a room, probably one room, because there were two bedrooms. So probably the two of us little kids slept with my mother and father, and they rented out the bedroom. And what was exciting was, and it became part of our family in later years, because Louis married Frances Vietzer, and it was her father and his brother who rented the room. So my mother thought, well, I'm going to make some money. Okay. So she rents out the room, and the reason being, she they had bought for my grandmother a Greenberg house. That's Greenberg Insurance, and it was 2710 Burt. She wanted to be with her family just desperately. She didn't even want to be separated by blocks. So the four of us move in. You get the contingent from Europe, and at one time there were 17 people living in this house, all related. And there were a lot of rooms, but I think my memory says it was one bathroom. I'm not sure. But it was a very large house, and it was a very lovely house. There was a sitting room, there was a living room, and then they had different bedrooms, and they actually had in the back, and this had to be, at one time, it was probably a very, very wealthy neighborhood, because in the back, they had a house for caretakers. And I don't know who lived in that house. At any rate, in 1922, when the entire mishpacha arrived, my brother and I are sleeping in a crib in one of the rooms, probably where my parents slept too. And I recall that the light went on, and it it was 22, so by that time I was 4 years old, and my two aunts, it was my aunt Anne Gorelick Rosenblatt, who was 13 years old, and then my aunt Ruth Gorelick Lasher, who was she was probably 4 or 5 years older, so she was probably 17 or 18. And I remember that's one of the wonderful little vignettes that I have in my brain on the day that they arrived from Europe. They were held back. They didn't get to come with the other part of the group, because my Aunt Anne had some kind of a rash, and they kept her back till she got well. So I remember them as vividly as yesterday, and it was very thrilling, very thrilling. The only thing is, it got to be a little bit too much with the 17 people, and my mother and father and the two little kids. We moved back to Gray Street, where we stayed till actually 1937, and that was our neighborhood. And we knew naturally. First of all, it was a walking community. Very few people had cars. We were lucky. My father, he's always borrowing money. That was the wonderful thing in his life, if he could own a car. Well, he got borrowed money, he got a car, then he could get to work. But my mother, if she went to work most of the time, in order to save car fare, she would take the buggy with the two of us and walk us. Had to be 2 miles, maybe more, but she was used to walking 20 miles, 30 miles, and she was tough. I mean, she was strong. So at any rate, we moved back to 2110 Gray Street. And one of the things that happened at 2110 Gray Street, I was 5 years old, enrolled in Kellum School. And like I told you, couldn't speak a word of English. And it's a fascinating thing, and it stays with me today. I'm a doodler like everybody else in the world. I couldn't understand a word the teacher said. I was just like, if you put me in a vault and there was nobody there, that's the way it was. But it didn't seem to bother me that much, because they gave me things to do. One of the things they gave me to do was to make paper mats. You have long slips of paper and you braid them. And then you make a little mat like this. And to this day, I'm always making these squares like this mat that I used to make in kindergarten. And I went to Kellum School, but I had a terrible, terrible accident. I was playing across the street from my house, 2110 Grace, and I'm 5 years old. Two boys come along and they say, with a bottle of pop, "This is strawberry pop, and we want you to drink it." And was smart enough to say no. And I started to run away. It was acid. And they threw it at me. It caught the back of my head. It burned me severely. I mean, it was bad. And I remember, of course, that's very vivid in my mind. And I remember screaming for my mother, and the neighbors, everybody heard. And my poor mother she didn't know, really what to do. And on top of this, where I lost all my skin, she put iodine. That's the last I remember. And so that year was lost to me. I have very little memory of it because what I used to have to do is go to the doctor and they would treat me, and I came out just when I had curly hair. I always had curls. And when I finally got hair after about a year and a half, it came out straight. Isn't that something? And at any rate, um, I remember the interesting thing was I remember how much my father took care of me. I had to be carried, couldn't walk, too sick. And he would do everything. He'd dress me, he'd feed me, take me to the bathroom. He was wonderful. He was wonderful. As a matter of fact, if we lost a button, my father would sew it on, not my mother. That wasn't her. That wasn't her area. She couldn't sew a darn. She couldn't sew a darn. So at any rate, I recovered, and I recovered well, and I got my hair back. At that time, I'm ready to enter the first grade, so I probably lost most of kindergarten. We are living at 2710 Burt Street, and incidentally, it was across from Creighton University. It was a lovely neighborhood, and they had lovely boulevards, and it was Webster School. And I remember the first day of school, I wore a beret, a little wool. I had no hair. I didn't have any hair for probably a year and a half. And I remember all the children were lined up, and that was probably one of the happiest days of my life because I came home and said to my parents, they never laughed at me. I thought they were all going to laugh at me. And the teacher was so good to me. And that's a saga. I fell in love with learning. Of course, I had plenty to learn. First, I didn't have a language, and then I had to learn the subjects, and then I had to learn it halfway because, it took me quite a while to grasp English, actually. And the teachers were so good to me, and the kids were so nice. So I always have had a happy experience in school, and that's why I'm very partial to schools and education. It means a lot to me. I just happened to, I was very lucky, but when you think about so many things today, and children are cruel, they're not nice to one another, they were all just wonderful. It was wonderful. So back I go to 2110 Gray Street. I went to Lake School. Every school that I went to Lake School, I graduated. I went to Central High School, and I graduated. And I went to the old University of Omaha, which is on 24th and Pratt. And when I went to that school, I went directly out of high school. And I remember the tuition, which was horrible to pay. And then I was working too. In our house, you came home from school, you went to work. You had to study later. And at any rate, the tuition was $35. They let us pay it out, but it was terrible. And actually, I went at my full freshman year, which was just totally delightful. And then then I quit school, and I went back even to this university, even after I was married, but I did not graduate. At any rate, as I say, I loved school. And then part of my life experience, it's a very exciting thing. The Jewish Community Center was one of the focal points of my life, and almost every Jewish child during my era, which was the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, where I was there all the time. Well, the exciting part about it was that you could go from Central High School, walk across the street, and you come on the after school, and you've got this whole world. You know how kids look always, they want to see their friends. They want to go somewhere where they can dance. They want to go somewhere where they can talk. Well, we had it all. And I go there, and I'm 10 years old, and that's where I met Norman. And actually, when I was a child, you name it, if it was sewing, I took sewing lessons. If it was drama, I did. And I started actually being interested in theater because my father wanted me to be on the stage, and I could sing, and I could act. So when I was 10, they had this play directed by Mrs. Herman Yar. She was the pediatrician's wife. Tough. Boy, she was tough. At any rate, it was a musical called The Toy Shop. I had the female lead, and one of my friends, Joe Harris, had the male lead. And he sang the production. Norman was a toy soldier. And here we are in rehearsal, and the two boys have a fight over me, and I'm devastated. Mrs. Yar comes along, and she decides who the wicked one was and slaps Norman straight across the face. And at any rate, um, the Jewish Community Center was was such a vital part of my life. First of all, I was always interested in the theater. So if they had something that had music in it or they had to have a kid in it, I was there. And as a matter of fact, one of the things at that particular time, it was more like when I was probably 9 years old. And maybe you've heard of the great Jewish actor Boris Tomaszewski. He was famous in Russia. And then when he came to New York, he was very famous. Well, he came to a theater here called The Strand to give a Jewish play. But they needed a child who could speak Yiddish. And I was elected. So I was in this play with him, and I guess I was 9 years old, and I could have been 8. And again, I have the most vivid recollection. I remember his face. He had a shock of white hair. Just, he wasn't a big man. And I was his child. My mother had died, and he married a woman who was the wicked stepmother. So the part that I remember, and my sister Cynthia, she was just tiny and remembers this particular scene. There's a break front, and my dad, Boris Tomaszewski is my father, and he's standing in front of it, and I'm crying, and I'm saying, this is all Yiddish. It's a totally Yiddish theater. And I said, oh, my stepmother, she's so mean to me. Sie gibt mir nicht kein Brot. Ich hab gar nicht was zu essen. Ich bin hungry. Ich will essen. Ich will. And he became so furious that he lashed out, hits the break front, and he broke something. I don't know. But Cynthia remembered because she thought he was mad at me. At any rate, she remembered. She is unusual. I mean, she's got a memory. She talked when she was 9 months old. And so her memory is so acute. And of course, I remember it very well, especially when this thing crashed. So at any rate, the Jewish Community Center played a part of my life, which really never stopped, because there were always different things. First of all, you belong to this club. And then you learn how to do this. And then you meet the boys and the girls. And then you have fun. And then came wartime, and they had dances. And it was such a focal point. It was just unbelievable. At any rate, uh, uh, Norman went to high school at Central High School in his freshman year. Then he transferred, but because of the Depression, and I was about 33, he and his parents, he had an older brother who stayed behind here in Omaha, they moved to Chicago. But I kept in touch with Norman one way or another. When we went to buy, I'd go with my mother to buy furniture. Um, I would call Norman and I would see him. And so we really kept it, and then he would visit here. And, um, and then he was drafted in before Pearl Harbor. So I never saw him, but what, what it ended up was that in 1945, in June 24, we were married. And it always, as I say, the Jewish community said, it always became a part of our lives. As a matter of fact, it's very, very exciting to me. But Norman was on the construction committee for the new Jewish Community Center, which is on 132nd. And then he was involved in the Rose Blumpkin Jewish Home also. And at any rate, we were married during the war, and we lived in Pueblo, and then we were very, very fortunate because married in June and August 8th, 45, the war is over, and we moved back to Omaha. And at that time, we didn't stay in Omaha too long. We went to Chicago, and I was very lonesome. And I said, I want to go back to Omaha. And his dad had a grocery store that was, it was in the, actually, in a downtown, in the Loop District. And he wanted Norman to stay, but anyway, we came back here. And, then we raised our children. We had Larry, and he was born in 46. And then Bobby was born in 48. And then our daughter Ellie was born in 1952. And here we are.